working daily and connecting those offers of help with the areas in which they're most needed, or being able to connect people so that they can collaborate on various projects. And we've also launched a Slack channel, an LSB Slack channel, to connect our community. In many cases, a lot of this work that I just described is happening on Slack. If you're interested in getting involved, just let us know and we can invite you into the channel. So as I mentioned, this is our first virtual event. As of last count, we had about 200 people registered. We currently have about 110 on the call. So thank you very much for coming. A couple of housekeeping notes. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, so please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to post your questions, and I'll be reviewing them throughout the seminar and leading the Q&A at the end. You can vote on questions that other people have submitted, so please keep your eye on those questions, and so if they are similar to what you have, you can vote and they will naturally rise to the top. During the Q&A at the end, we have 2 polls that will be posted where we're looking for feedback both on the session and ideas of other webinars that you would be interested in having. If those topics aren't listed in the poll, please reach out to Ryan or I directly, and we can look at pulling together the content of what you're recommending. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Ali, who's the President and CEO of Novature Ventures, to introduce the speakers.
Thank you, Wendy. I hope you guys can hear me. Thank you to Wendy, Ryan, Dana, and everyone else for putting this together. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Novature Ventures, I'm delighted to have you join us on this webinar today. We hope you find this webinar educational and you'll be able to move forward with your life science innovation successfully. The objective for this webinar is to understand the regulatory challenges and opportunities that COVID-19 presents for our sector. More than ever before, there is a significant interest in development of novel diagnostics, vaccines, and treatments. At Novature Ventures, we're finding that both Health Canada and FDA are very receptive to our proposed projects and applications. There are some changes along the way with intellectual property and the way it's viewed and treated during these extraordinary times, and we're delighted to go over those as well. Without further ado, I'd like to invite our first speaker, Ellie Barris. Ellie is a Senior Regulatory Affairs Officer with the Medical Devices Bureau at Health Canada. She classifies medical devices, interprets regulations to clarify licensing, labeling requirements, and drafts guidance for the industry. Ellie is also the in-house reference person for software as a medical device classification. Previously, she worked as a food safety regulatory policy and was a program specialist, and she has a master's degree in neurosciences from University of Toronto. We're delighted to have you here with us, Ellie. We know you and your colleagues are extremely busy, so thank you so much for joining us. Go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you very much for the lovely introduction, and thank you also for inviting me to this webinar today. Are you able to see my screen? Can I get a thumbs up from the other panelists if you can see everything? Yes, great. Okay. And I had clicked on the wrong one. There we go. So yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. The focus of my talk today is to provide a very high-level overview and point you to a lot of useful tools and resources and web links that we have published that provide supplementary information that will help you to really understand the process to follow to authorize your COVID-19 medical device in the context of the current pandemic state. Throughout the presentation, I will be referring to COVID-19 medical devices specifically. A COVID-19 medical device is a medical device that's manufactured, sold, or represented for use in relation to COVID-19. So this is very important because some of the pathways that I'll be talking about for authorization today are specifically only for COVID-19 medical devices. A medical device, just to make sure we're all on the same page and we understand what's within the scope of my talk and what's regulated by the directorate that I work with. A medical device is essentially a product that's intended to diagnose, treat, mitigate, or prevent a disease, restore, modify, or correct body structure. That's a very abbreviated version of the definition. The full definition itself is actually found in the Food and Drugs Act. The important piece to remember here is that it's what we call an instrument, a device, a product that does not primarily act through pharmacological, chemical, immunological, or metabolic means. Products that act by those means primarily are usually regulated as drugs or natural health products in Canada. Now that I've sort of walked you through what is a COVID-19 medical device and what is a medical device, very high level overview of how those products are then subcategorized by Health Canada. So there's two sort of categorization systems. The first one is in vitro diagnostics versus non-in vitro diagnostics. So in vitro diagnostics are products that are used to examine a specimen in vitro. So something like RT-PCR, serology testing, those are generally in vitro diagnostics. Non-in vitro diagnostics is basically everything else. So here's an example of some of the devices that we've seen in the context of COVID-19 that are non-in vitro diagnostics: gowns, masks, gloves, infrared thermometers, and ventilators. The second sort of categorization system is a classification system that's based on the relative level of risk for each product. So the classification goes from class 1 to class 4, class 1 being the lowest relative risk and class 4 being the highest relative risk. In the context of COVID-19, generally all COVID-19 in vitro diagnostic devices are class 3 medical devices. And the in vitro diagnostics, the classification varies again based off the risk. To make things a little bit easier for you in terms of understanding the classification of your potential device, I've included the classifications of some common COVID-19 devices on this slide. However, you can contact us if you have an innovative product or something that you don't see here, and we'll help you to classify your product, or we can verify the classification of it as well. So now that I've walked you through what's a COVID-19 medical device and what are common COVID-19 medical devices, next I'll walk through the three pathways that have been implemented or tweaked for authorization of COVID-19 medical devices. The first one is the device interim order authorization. This is in relation to an interim order that was published on March 18th that falls under the Food and Drugs Act. The second is the medical device establishment licensing scheme. This is a scheme that already exists, but we are performing expedited and abbreviated approvals in the context of COVID-19. And then the third pathway is exceptional importation and sale. That relates to an interim order that was published on March 30th. So the next couple of slides will walk you through some of the comparisons between the two main pathways, which are the device interim order and the establishment license. So instead of repeating medical device establishment license all the time, I'm just going to refer to it as an MDEL. So the first key difference between these two pathways is that the device interim order application is per device. So every different type of device that you want to put on the market needs to have its own authorization. So for example, I'm a manufacturer of gloves and ventilators. I will need to apply for an authorization for my gloves, and I'll need to apply for an authorization for my ventilators. The establishment license application, on the other hand, is for certain activities. So it's for the importation of class 3 medical devices. So the order is for the distribution of class 1 medical devices. The class 1 medical device manufacturers have the luxury of choosing between the interim order authorization pathway or the establishment license authorization pathway. So I will walk you through some of the differences between the two, which will hopefully help you to pick the pathway that is best suited to your needs. So as I mentioned, first off, the device interim order authorization is for all classes of medical devices, and it's specifically for manufacturers. So the manufacturer is the person that's ultimately responsible for the device. It doesn't have to be specifically the factory or the person managing the factory that does the physical fabrication. It's the person whose name and address goes on the labeling at the end of the day, and the person who's responsible for complaint handling, recalls, all that fun stuff. The MDL pathway is for importers and distributors of any class of device, as well as class 1 manufacturers. There's a little footnote there that's important to remember. COVID-19 medical devices with IO authorizations can be imported and distributed by people who do not have an establishment license. So usually, under normal terms, let's say for a regular medical device, the manufacturer would get the device license, and then the importer distributor needs to have an MDL in order to import and distribute that product. Specifically for COVID-19 medical devices that have an IO authorization, the importers and distributors do not need to have the establishment license. They just need to have a copy of the IO authorization and make sure that that accompanies the shipment every step along the way. So, you know, at the border, with some type of way to access it with the truck, and the delivery in case there needs to be a verification at that point. And then the second footnote is that there are certain exceptions for retailers and healthcare facilities for the MDLs. So retailers and healthcare facilities generally do not need an establishment license. Moving on, so more differences for the IO authorization pathway. There's a request form that needs to be submitted. There's an attestation in there that the manufacturer is attesting that the device is safe and effective, and that they do have complaint handling, recall reporting, etc. procedures in place. And there's also a need to submit labeling and evidence of quality, safety, and effectiveness. So there are a series of standards that have been published on the Health Canada website to help guide industry in understanding what we expect in terms of supporting evidence for quality, safety, and effectiveness. And those are found in the resources slides at the end of my presentation. In terms of the MDL pathway, it's really just an application form, and then again, an attestation signed by the person responsible for the establishment license. There's no fee for an IO authorization. We've completely waived the fees. The establishment license does have a fee, and that's because that establishment license allows you to perform whatever activity you checked off. So let's say import class 2 medical devices for all devices. So not just specifically COVID-19 medical devices. It's an authorization that allows you to perform the activities listed on that license for any medical device, not just the COVID-19 medical devices. And then lastly, how long is it valid for? The IO authorization is valid for as long as the interim order is in effect. So essentially until the minister decides to withdraw or cancel the interim order. And then the establishment license is valid for as long as it's active. There's an annual review, an annual fee associated with it as well. So you can, in theory, continue to have that establishment license long after the COVID-19 pandemic is over. Just to give you a brief overview of our workload at the moment and sort of the numbers associated with each pathway. So right now we have about 500 IO authorizations that are being processed. And that processing involves like the review of the safety and effectiveness data, the review of the labeling, the review of the content of the application. Whereas the establishment licensing group has fewer in process because that processing is really like the process on our side involves processing of the application form and making sure that's been signed by the appropriate people. And so that sort of tries to explain a bit of the discrepancy between the two pathways there. However, overall, there have been way more establishment license applications than there have been device interim order authorizations. I've included below 2 links. One is to the list of diagnostic tests that have been authorized under the interim order, as well as a list of non-diagnostic devices that have been authorized under the interim order. So if you are looking to import something, for example, and you want to make sure that you're importing something that does have an authorization already, you can take a look in that list. Next, I will walk you through the third pathway. This pathway is managed by a different group at Health Canada, so I'm going to provide a very high-level overview. And there, again, there is a link to an email address that you can send your questions to if you have additional questions specifically on this topic. So the third pathway is for an IO that was published on March 30th. It involves a list of designated medical devices. These devices can be imported without meeting some of the requirements in the regulations, such as the labeling requirements. And if an importer wants to import one of these designated medical devices, they need to notify Health Canada using a form. It's important to note that an establishment license is still required to import these designated medical devices. So it's sort of an add-on to the establishment licensing process. Again, at the bottom, I've added a point saying that importers can apply to add new devices to the list using the request form. So, you know, if there's something else that you think should be on that list that you'd like to import, but you know that it's missing a couple of the requirements, for example, you can apply and then we'll take a look at that. A last requirement, and again, I just want to give a very brief overview on this. This was another piece to the March 30th interim order relating to shortages. So I included a brief summary of the definition of a shortage at the top of the slide. It's a situation where a manufacturer cannot meet the demand. And it does not include a situation where a substitute is available. So it's very specific. Manufacturers and importers must report shortages. A manufacturer can designate an importer to report on their behalf, so you don't have to send two reports. There are two types of shortages, actual and anticipated. So unable to meet the actual demand and unable to meet the anticipated demand. And information about a shortage has to be reported when the manufacturer first becomes aware, when there's updated information that needs to be submitted, and at the end of the shortage. So again, there are some links at the end of my presentation that go into shortage reporting in more detail. And again, it's a very specific addition to our regulation of COVID-19 medical devices. So the next couple of slides are just going to be running through some resources very quickly for both medical device manufacturers and if you're a manufacturer of a different product, directing you towards some key links. So here are some very high level resources. If you are planning to manufacture, import, distribute any of the products on this list, I highly recommend starting here because this will link you out to all of the other places that need to go to get the information you'll need to make sure you are manufacturing, importing, distributing compliant devices. This slide is specifically for the device interim order application pathway. If you do have any questions about that pathway or device classification, this is the email address to contact. You can mention that your question is as a result of today's webinar, and you can also mention my name. We are a very small team, but the work is distributed evenly. So, you know, if you mention that this is a follow-up to today's webinar and it's a question that you have stemming from something that I said, I can work with my colleagues to make sure that we come up with a response that's appropriate. This is the link for the establishment license applications. There's a guidance and then the email address if you have questions about those. Key resources for PPE. So this is very dynamic space. It's changing all the time. We're adding new standards that we're recognizing. We're adding new information. So, you know, bookmark these onto your web browser and take a look at them regularly if you are planning to manufacture, import, or distribute personal protective equipment. Key resources for the exceptional importation and sale piece. So the links to the request forms are there as well. And finally, some links for the shortage reporting. I think this is my second last slide, so bear with me, I'm almost done. These are some key Government of Canada resources. If you are not a manufacturer, importer, or distributor of medical devices currently, but you want to offer a service, you want to donate some supplies, you have skilled workers that can be It can work across the country. You want to retool some of your manufacturing. So say you're a garment manufacturer, but now you want to manufacture medical gowns. This is the slide for you. If you are looking to scale up or retool your manufacturing, get in contact with Innovation Canada. They've set up a really great call for action, excuse me, where they connect people in the industry together. So say you are that garment manufacturer, they will connect you with experts on the standards that need to be met for medical gown manufacturing to make sure that you have that expertise available to you. And then if you are working on research, there's a funding opportunity that's been put forth by the National Research Council. Finally, this is my last slide. If you're not a medical device manufacturer, I apologize for putting you through 20 minutes of talking about medical devices. But this slide is about hard surface disinfectants and hand sanitizers. So a key difference here, sanitizers and disinfectants for medical devices are generally considered to be medical devices themselves. So if you're manufacturing a disinfectant for ventilators, or you want to reprocess N95 masks, you still need to contact the medical devices group. If you're planning to manufacture hand sanitizers or hard surface disinfectants, take a look at these links. Again, this is information that's being updated regularly. We're now allowing the use of technical grade ethanol for the manufacture of hand sanitizers, really expanding the scope to make sure that everyone is safe and protected during this COVID-19 pandemic. So with that, that's the end of my presentation, and I will turn it back over to Ali to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you, Ellie. That was fantastic. Really appreciate you and your colleagues' effort. It's unbelievable the amount of work you guys are doing, over 500 applications. That's amazing. I want to do a couple of housekeeping items here. There is a little call out button down at the bottom of your screen. It's Q&A. Please click on it. Please ask questions, and you can also vote on questions, and we're going to be going over these questions at the end of this session. Also want to remind you that the slides that we're going to go over today is going to be available on Life Sciences BC and Novotour's website, and we're recording this session, so you'll be able to enjoy it later. So I'd like to introduce the next speaker. Ian McGill is the lead US Diagnostics for Regulatory Affairs at Novotour Ventures. He's the regulatory affairs professional with a broad industry experience, having worked in novel in vitro diagnostics and life-sustaining active implantable devices marketed globally. Ian focuses on creative regulatory strategy that results in efficient interactions with regulatory agencies. He has experience in 510K, 510K de novo, PMA, CE marking, medical device license applications, and emergency use authorization submissions. He started his career in industry working for research and development and transitioned to regulatory affairs. He's familiar with challenges facing startups and small businesses and provides regulatory guidance tailored to smaller organizations. Ian holds a master's degree in medical diagnostic laboratory from University of Arizona, and he's currently part of American Society for Quality Certified Biomedical Auditors. Thank you, Ian, for joining us. Please start your presentation.
Thank you for that introduction, Ali. Thank you, Elaine, for your presentation. All right, let's get going here. So today I'm going to discuss how to navigate the FDA emergency use authorization pathway for COVID-19 in vitro diagnostic tests, specifically developed by commercial manufacturers. Here we go. All right, so to begin, I'm going to cover a bit of background on the EUA pathway, followed by the COVID-19 policy guidance document issued by FDA, going into detail on differences in their validation recommendations according to test type, pathways to distribution, and key informational resources for manufacturers. Now, under Section 564 of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the FDA Commissioner may allow unapproved medical devices or unapproved uses of approved medical products to be used in an emergency to treat, diagnose, or prevent serious or life-threatening diseases or conditions caused by CBRNs, which are chemical, biological, radiological nuclear threat agents, where no adequate, approved, or available alternatives are available. Oh, pardon me. Looks like we had a glitch. All right, back on track. So in response to the global pandemic, FDA has authorized several types of medical countermeasures through the emergency use authorization pathway. Now there's several types of EUA categories: in vitro diagnostic products, which is going to be the focus of my talk today, high complexity molecular-based LDTs, PPE and decon systems, ventilators and other medical devices, and therapeutics. These all have very specific requirements, and it was beyond the scope of this discussion to get into detail on all of these today, but you can visit the recent final medical device guidance documents related to COVID-19 public health emergency. FDA has a list of all of these guidance documents that is maintained at the link provided on this slide. Now, most of you have been tracking the progression of the global crisis and are aware that the United States struggled to contain the outbreak of the novel coronavirus pandemic and the resulting COVID-19 disease. The management of the problem was struggling in large part due to the spread of the disease early on through asymptomatic carriers. Now, early on, the United States lacked adequate testing resources and recommended that tests be reserved for the most severely ill and symptomatic patients. Now most experts agreed that the true scope of the infection is unknown due to the spread of the disease through asymptomatic carriers, but also a lack of widespread testing. However, significantly worldwide, but as well in the United States, we've seen a steep ramp up in the availability of testing. And to give you some perspective on that, around March 1st, the United States was completing somewhere between 1 and 10 tests per million residents. And as of April 20th, which is the last day I checked this data, the United States was performing close to 12,000 tests per million residents. So the question is, how do we get from point A to point B? Well, on February 4th, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Alex Azar, issued a determination of public health emergency that allowed the authorization of emergency use devices, such as in vitro diagnostic devices, for detection and diagnosis of the novel coronavirus. Following this determination, FDA issued the immediately in effect guidance Policy for Diagnostic Tests for Coronavirus Disease 2019 on March 16, 2020. The guidance document details the requirements for clinical labs and manufacturers of in vitro diagnostic testing seeking emergency use authorization. And as I noted earlier, I'm going to primarily focus on the portions of the document relevant to commercial manufacturers of IVDs. So the guidance document can be broken down into 4 major categories: validation recommendations, notification requirements, distribution of tests, and submission of your emergency use authorization request submission. Now, many of you have heard of these 3 types of tests: molecular-based tests that include PCR assays, antigen-based tests, and serological-based tests. FDA provides validation recommendations that are specific to the underlying technological principles of the test. And the guidance document addresses these 3 major categories. Today, I'm primarily going to focus on molecular and serological tests, as these represent the majority of tests that are currently in use in the market today. So for molecular test validation, FDA recommends limit of detection studies, clinical evaluation studies, inclusivity, and cross-reactivity studies. For antigen-based tests, they recommend limit of detection, cross-reactivity, clinical agreement. For serological-based tests, they indicate cross-reactivity, class specificity, and a clinical agreement study should be performed. Now, molecular tests have the most detail provided in the guidance document, and FDA provides guidance on acceptable sample types, use of contrived versus clinical specimens, required replicates for clinical testing, and then for cross-reactivity, a list of potentially cross-reactive organisms that should be tested in silico, as well as guidance on if there's greater than 80% homology, what type of wet testing should be conducted. Now, the use of contrived specimens, FDA has indicated that this is allowed for molecular-based tests and antigen-based tests. However, it is not acceptable for serological-based tests. FDA recommends that human specimens from microbiologically confirmed cases of COVID-19, meaning an RT-PCR assay, should be used for validation of serological type tests. Now, recently, there's been a lot of scrutiny over serological tests that have gone through a certain pathway that hasn't had FDA review of their performance. So FDA, to kind of quell some of the concern about this that's been emanating in the public, has partnered with NIH, CDC, and BARDA to provide positive sera and negative sera and make that available to manufacturers in order to validate their serological test. This is a voluntary program, and you can get more information on this program at the CDRH OIR POPS email address on this slide. More details are forthcoming, but right now the agency is asking that you engage them in discussion to get information on this pathway. Now, once your validation is complete, the next step is to notify FDA. And there's two categories of notification that allow for distribution of tests. And this has been a point of major confusion for many people out there. For molecular diagnostics, FDA is allowing manufacturers to distribute their tests following validation and notification to FDA of their intent to distribute. So molecular manufacturers can notify FDA by emailing the CDRH EUA templates email address. They should include a cover letter stating that their validation is complete and they intend to distribute their tests. The cover letter should include the name, address, and contact person, and a copy of the IFU and summary of assay performance should be attached. Now, back to the confusing part. For serological tests, there are two pathways to market: the emergency use authorization pathway and the notification pathway. And the notification pathway is where lots of scrutiny has been lately. The EUA pathway, in contrast, is required for tests with an infection or sole diagnosis claim. Per the FDA guidance, although FDA has not approved any tests with this claim thus far, and they've actually discouraged people from using tests for this purpose. The notification pathway, on the other hand, is appropriate for tests with a qualitative detection claim for IgG or IgM antibodies. Under this pathway, manufacturers should notify FDA by emailing the CDRH templates email address with the subject line antibody test notification and include the same information I previously mentioned. It should be mentioned, though, that the summary of performance is required for this pathway. It's not actively being reviewed by FDA, and this is where a lot of the concern has arisen recently. So for manufacturers that want to avoid being lumped in with all of this public concern over faulty tests, I'd recommend, if you have the validation data to back it, to go down the emergency use authorization pathway. So following notification and FDA acknowledgement, molecular test manufacturers can immediately distribute their tests as long as they submit an EUA request within 15 business days. They're required to post instructions for use and information on assay performance and test characteristics on their website in the interim period of time. Serological tests, on the other hand, going through the EUA pathway, cannot distribute their tests and must wait until receiving authorization. However, serological tests with the qualitative claims going through the notification pathway can distribute their tests following FDA notification and registration and listing of their device. Manufacturers are listing their device. They should do so under the product code QKO and use the term enforcement under the submission number field. So finally, after 15 business days has passed, molecular manufacturers should submit their EUA request using the template provided by FDA. They should also include a cover letter and a completed FDA Form 3514. The EUA template provides additional detail on the recommendations provided in the FDA guidance document. And of course, your EUA request should include description of test principles, procedures, and labeling, including the IFU and the healthcare and patient fact sheets, which are new and unique to this EUA process. They require manufacturing distribution information, information such as units manufactured per week. It's recommended you submit a comprehensive distribution plan with a complete list of all your current distributors. And of course, the performance evaluation and executive summaries of your validation study and protocol should be included. Now, this process is very dynamic. FDA is providing updates every day. And in fact, yesterday, FDA announced the first authorization of a home collection device for a nasal swab and an RT-PCR test that will be performed in the lab. This could be a game changer, and FDA has indicated that potentially home testing, complete home testing and test interpretation is on the way. So I would stay tuned to all these resources as they're changing daily. The frequently asked questions is a great place to start. It has lots of information on the policy guidance document. If you have specific questions and you want to engage FDA in real time, there's an FDA town hall series that has been ongoing, and the archive chats are available on fda.gov. But there's also 2 live chats on April 22nd and 29th from 12 to 1:15 Eastern time. There's also a 24-hour FDA hotline. Believe me, it is 24 hours. I've tested that. But this is really just useful for general questions. They're not going to give you specific questions about the validation of your device. They're going to refer you to the CDRH EUA templates email address. Of course, FDA lists all the authorized tests and listed tests on their website. That is updated continuously. And I would just say that if your test uses novel technology or novel instrument or an extraction method that hasn't previously been reviewed by the agency, to engage FDA in a pre-EUA dialogue. It's absolutely free. It's similar to the pre-submission, although they get back to you much more rapidly. And it's recommended if you have any questions before submitting your emergency use authorization request. Again, there's a test kit manufacturer EUA template provided by FDA that's specific to molecular tests right now. If you do email FDA, they'll give you some kind of unofficial guidance on the serological test information. And I am told that they are working on a serological test template that's specific to those types of tests. But right now, if you have all your validation data, engage them in dialogue, but they're recommending people use the molecular test template. So I know this is all a bit confusing and it's changing daily, but it's, you know, if you, as I recommend with all submissions, if you engage the agency early and often, you're going to have a lot smoother path to market. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. Last but not least, just before I introduce the next speaker, I'd like to remind you of the call out button at the bottom of your screen. Please go ahead, insert your questions and vote on the other questions that other participants have entered. I'd like to introduce our last speaker, Thomas Digby. He's the Global IP Lead at Novator Ventures. He's a US and Canadian intellectual property and transaction attorney. He works in the field of small molecule biologics, generics and biosimilars, research tools and therapeutic targets, biofuels, biomass-derived chemicals. With over 22 years in practice, Tom has devised a wide range of clients from seed stage VC funded startups, as well as global pharmas such as Novartis. While at Novartis, he led the specialized IP asset management with a team that focused on enforcement of IP rights with the goal of revenue generation. Enforcement proceeds were over $650 million. Thomas has specific expertise in license and M&A, due diligence, negotiation, and dispute resolution. He has deep experience in complex global IP issues related to tax, transfer pricing, supply chain management, and compliance with international trade sanctions. He holds a doctorate of law degree from Dalhousie University. Delighted to have you here with us, Tom. Please go ahead.
Super. Thank you, Ali. And I'm pleased to be with you all. And certainly very interested to see what Ian just said and what Ellie said. I mean, the sheer volume of work you guys are handling with new products coming through COVID-19 is quite fascinating. And so for me today, I tried to decide what would be most interesting for the people on the call. So I put together this little scenario that I thought would apply to you all. Let's say you're a vendor and you want to launch a COVID-19 related product in Canada and or the US. You're probably looking at both markets. So, and this is the categories we've been looking at. It's probably a diagnostic test or PPE or a medical device. You might have a software app that you think is ready for the market. And of course, you might be in therapeutics or vaccines. The latter, I keep sort of in a separate category because presumably you have a longer term strategy if you're in therapeutics or vaccines. But so I'm thinking you might have sales projections. Maybe it's small, maybe it's $100,000 over the next 6 months, or maybe you're thinking of like $500,000 in sales, or 2 million or 10 million in sales by the end of the year, where you roll out the product. So in this kind of case, you might be concerned about a potential third-party patent. And what should you care about? Very high level, the most important thing, you're worried you might get blocked from the market by some kind of patent injunction. So we need to look at that. What if that would be fatal if you've gone to all this work and developed your equipment and then suddenly you're blocked by an injunction. And then secondly, something you might understand more easily is you might be sued for damages. So there's going to be some sort of cost if you're infringing a third-party patent. And in this case, we're going to assume that the third-party patent has some validity to it, and you don't want to, necessarily challenge it and try and take it down in a court. So let's say you're taking this in Canada, you're coming to the market, you've got your approval through Ellie's office. And what about the patent? Well, the good news for you, the vendor, is that compulsory licensing is now in effect in Canada from now until September 30th, 2020. Now, I call it compulsory licensing. Those words are not used in the Act. You may remember that in the middle of March, the federal government pushed through their new bill, C-13. It was the COVID-19 Emergency Response Act, had a whole lot of financial terms in it and a variety of regulatory adjustments. Well, one of the things it included was this new Patent Act, Section 19.4. And what it says in 19.4 is that the Commissioner of Patents shall authorize any person to make, use, and sell a patented invention to the extent necessary to respond to the public health emergency. Well, that's quite striking. This is quite novel. We have not had compulsory licensing in Canada since the late 80s. And so this is a sudden reversion relating to this particular public health emergency. And so what do you need to get this? So I need to point out the commissioner shall authorize. This is not an optional thing. This is not the commissioner may authorize. It's that she shall authorize. So the authorization must come on an application from the Minister of Health. It's a bit complicated to get this authorization, but if you went to the Minister of Health and the minister were to name you as a person who is eligible to use the patent, and then secondly, you go to the Chief Public Health Officer and get her to confirm there's a public health emergency of national concern, then you can get this authorization, which is valid for 1 year or until the emergency ends, whichever comes sooner. So there you go. In contravention of a lot of our commitments under the World Trade Organization and stuff, we suddenly have compulsory licensing in this limited context of this public health emergency. Now, wait a second. What about the patent holder in this scenario? So didn't she just get robbed? We're just giving these away. Well, no, we're not, because there's partial good news for the patent holder. The compulsory license is going to be subject to compensation, but don't get too enthusiastic, because look at this here. The government of Canada and any person authorized shall pay to the patentee any amount that the commissioner considers to be adequate remuneration in the circumstances. Well, and then it goes on to explain adequate remuneration, the economic value, the extent to which they make. Let me just say, this is incredibly ambiguous. There is very little clarity. And, in fact, if we could extend this webinar by 3 hours, we could have a nice chat about what adequate remuneration might or might not mean in this circumstance. And let me just tell you, you have to get, since we just talked, you've got the Minister of Health, so that'd be Patty Hajdu. You've got the Chief Public Author, you got Teresa Tam, and then you have the Commissioner of Patents, that's Johanna Belle. So these three people are coming together to sort out what your adequate remuneration is. Let me just tell you, that sounds like a waiting room in hell for me. And so you really do not want to get involved in this process if you don't have to. And here's some friendly legal advice. If you believe your product sale is going to infringe someone's patent, now is the time to go to them and negotiate. Because either you're going to come to reasonable terms with this person who has this patent, or else you're going to end up in this waiting room in hell trying to get various ministers and commissioner of patents to help you figure out what the value is for your patent. So really, that's the summary here, is that if you can anticipate this in any way, you've got leverage here as the vendor. You know, you're going to be able to come to market, and it's just a question of coming to reasonable terms on the patent. I'll make a final point about Canada, is that in Canada, this Patent Act amendment does not extend to any other IP rights, like copyright or trademark. So there's no get out of jail free card for software. You can't just steal someone else's app and start selling it. You're not going to get any credit for that. Counterfeiters or trademark pirates, like, don't call your face mask the Starbucks face mask, because you're going to get sued by Starbucks, right? But you can get the face mask onto the market. So okay, so this is a patent exception, and it's new, and this only applies until the end of September. So if you're having any patent problems, you've got to get this filed with the Minister of Health as soon as possible. Okay, let's move on from Canada and go to the United States. And we're going to take the same scenario in the United States. You've got a product and you're a vendor and you want to launch, and there might be a third-party patent out there. You know, sometimes it's unclear whether the patent's going to apply or not. It's a bit ambiguous, but it might be out there, so you need to know what to do. Well, did the US do compulsory licensing like in Canada? Well, of course not. Of course not. IP rights are sacred in the United States. You know, it's not actually in the Constitution. People act as if property rights are in the Constitution. They're not actually in the Constitution, but they IP rights are always considered sacred. So no, there's no change to the patent law. So we're dealing with the old law, but the context has suddenly changed because we're in the context of a public health emergency. So there are some existing federal statutory remedies that can force a license in the US. Some of you who've been in the life sciences field, you may be familiar that if a patent was generated with federal funds, the US government always retains march-in rights. So the government can, if the patent holder is not meeting the needs of the public, the health or safety needs, and they're not being reasonably satisfied, then the government can force a license and transfer a license to another person, being you, the vendor. There is a second statute where the US can actually expropriate patent or copyright subject to compensation. And this would apply to all patents that are, so not just federally funded inventions, but any patent of anyone. So that can be simply seized under this expropriation rights. But let me just make it very, very clear. Neither of these remedies is likely to be applied in your favor. These items have been on the books for 40 years in the case of Bayh-Dole, and it has never been effectively enforced anywhere in the US. It is, in very rare cases, I've seen it threatened, that the government threatens to use these things, but they never do. Basically, it's a tool to force the patent people to come to an agreement between themselves to make these inventions. So unfortunately, there's no existing statutory remedy. So you still got this problem of what about your product? You want to launch it and you don't want it to be blocked from the market. Well, let me tell you this little insight. The best solution for a vendor for you lies in the patent enforcement litigation process. So let's just walk through it quickly here, and we will see, you know, where this falls out, how you're going to get to come to market. So let's say you get this contract with some buyer in the US and you launch and you sell your product. The patent holder finds out about that and the patent holder sues you. And it's obviously going to demand the two things that patent holders always demand. One is an injunction to block the sales. And the second is as monetary damages for infringement of the patent. So this is obviously the risk that you're facing. So you, as the vendor, you must resolve these demands somehow. Now, I think most of us would be willing to say, you know, the financial negotiation, it's reasonable to expect that monetary damages can be resolved by negotiation. So you may have to pay a royalty or a lump sum fee or a fee per unit sold. You know, fair people who want to facilitate things can come to a conclusion about the value. But the injunction is slightly different because, just to be clear, there's two types of injunction. There's a preliminary injunction that the patent holder raises first motion of all, usually the same day as the patent lawsuit is filed, that the patent holder wants to push for an injunction, a preliminary injunction. A permanent injunction applies at the end of the lawsuit when things are determined in your favor, then you can get a permanent injunction to block sales permanently. So this is quite a serious risk for a product developer who wants to launch, because all your expenses are at risk and you can potentially be blocked from the market. Well, let's see. Here's some good news for the vendor. The patent holder is extremely unlikely to succeed in blocking sales by injunction for a COVID-19 product during the COVID-19 pandemic. And the reason you know this is that one of the central questions the court will ask in an injunction hearing is it in the public interest? Whether the injunction is in the public interest. It's a basic criteria. And in many court cases, it doesn't matter. There's no public interest in getting, you know, an improved dog collar onto the market or some sort of marginal product of incremental value. But in the COVID-19 pandemic, there definitely is a public interest in seeing these products on the market. So you are pretty much in a strong position to have a plausible case of building this public interest argument in your favor. And if you can't, then you've got a bad lawyer. Let me give you a few clues on that. The vendor, you'll need some clear evidence of the demand. For example, the failure of the patent holder to serve some selected market segment. You know, you want to sell your diagnostic in California and it's clearly not in California, or there's some selected markets in Seattle or Chicago or something you have your eye on that the patent holder is not there already. So you want to be able to prove that there's some selected market that's waiting for you. And in order to secure your position, you need expert evidence on the current market need. This is some information you want to gather now before you go to market, rather than 2 years from now when you're looking back saying, oh yeah, there was a real market need in Chicago back then. And people will say, well, you know, you say that now, but you know, what proof do you have at the time? So it's the question of evidence here. So let me just motivate you to think it's very likely your COVID-19 product will avoid injunction and come to market, but damages will need to get sorted out and you'll have to pay some kind of compensation. And my final point to all of this is that one major difference between the US and Canada is that the US patent holder may get a slightly higher royalty than a Canadian patent holder. And the reason for this difference is the rule of willful infringement. The US permits triple damages for willful patent infringement, but there is no equivalent of that in Canada. There's only modest punitive damages if you deliberately infringe a patent. So if you were going to pay a 2% royalty in Canada on your sales, you might be willing to pay a 3% royalty in the US, or even 4%. And the only advice I give to you on that as a vendor is to be sure to charge a higher price in the US to cover off the risk of these triple damages. So that's just a simple view of willful infringement. So with that, I'll leave it at that. you can bring your products to market. Patents still remain valid, but you can find ways to stick handle it if you do your best. And with that, I will stop sharing and pass it back to Ali and the team.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Ian, and thanks, Ellie. We have some questions that I will run through. Thanks for those of you that have submitted questions. You can keep submitting them or voting on them. So I'm going to start with one that I think is more directed to you, Ellie, and that is, the person says, not sure if it was addressed, but what's the rough time frame currently for review/approval of IO applications?
Thank you for the question. We are prioritizing review of IO applications within the directorate, while also working our best to maintain our service standards and expectations for current regular medical device license applications. So I cannot give you a definitive timeline and say the turnaround will be 2 days. That's dynamic, and that changes on a daily basis depending on the volume of applications that we receive. We are mobilizing internally to improve our resources, bring on new staff, improve our procedures to make things really fast and efficient. So rest assured that we are working to pass through those applications very quickly, and we are prioritizing them within the queue.
Thanks, Ellie. And as you showed the numbers, it's extraordinary the volume that that you guys are managing through and the volume that you have ahead of you. So thank you on behalf of everyone. We know you're working hard finding that balance of ensuring that the quality of products coming onto the market meet the standard that we would like to see, at the same time as trying to be fast.
Yeah, and if I can add one more thing to that, Wendy, you know, we spend a lot of our time managing deficient applications, right? That's the number one sort of bottleneck in the whole process, and that's what takes up a lot of our time and resources. So if you have a question about your application, you're not sure how to fill something out, it's better to email and ask than to shove your application through the process and then ask for forgiveness later. It's really best to, you know, of course, do your due diligence on your own and check out our website. If there is something that you find really confusing, point that out to us, explain it to us so we can also improve our resources. Maybe there's 10 other people that have the same question or that are unsure about the same thing. So please do contact us if you have any questions, and we'll be happy to answer them and make sure that we help you to manage and build your application and understand the requirements.
That's great advice. Thank you for pointing that out, because I'm sure incomplete applications can just slow you down. So getting it right the first time is always best. There is a question that's somewhat related to that, and that is that in light of all this that is going on with COVID-19 applications, I'm sure you've had this question before, will responses to applications to Health Canada for non-COVID related medical devices be delayed as a result?
So I think I partially answered this question at the beginning of my answer to the last question. So we are, again, as I said, mobilizing internal resources, bringing on new staff, changing our procedures internally as well in the midst of all the craziness that's been going on, to try and make sure that we do manage our regular medical device application, license applications within the same service standards and expectations. And the same thing goes for questions. Again, we are prioritizing the COVID-19 medical device related questions, but everything is still being distributed as it is received. Like, we don't just put those in a pile and say we'll deal with them a month from now. Like, you send your question in to the generic inbox, it gets distributed to an officer, and the officer will start working on the response to your question. So it's sort of business as usual for the regular medical device license applications and questions. We're just prioritizing the COVID-19 ones.
Okay, great, thanks. Ian, this one's for you. Do you know if BARDA would make CIRA available to Canadian manufacturers?
Okay.
Yeah, me. Yeah.
With the information that is available right now, as the caveat, yes, I believe they would, provided that the Canadian manufacturer has an intent to distribute those tests within the United States. Some of the information they want you to send initially in your information request about the program includes the volume of tests currently available to distribute in the United States and your weekly production volume. So if you don't have any intent to distribute in the United States, it's not likely they'd provide you with that information or with access to the SARA. But if you do, like, for example, if you go through the notification pathway rather than the EUA pathway and you want access to that and you want them to evaluate your test, it's likely they would allow you to do that. And then you could use that, I don't know what Ellie thinks, but potentially use that data for Health Canada evaluation later on.
Okay, thanks. Ellie, did you want to comment on that at all, or?
I invite the person who asked that question to send that question to the generic inbox.
Okay.
I would need to consult with a couple colleagues before I can answer that one.
Okay, thank you. Next question. So the FDA is working with CDC and BARDA to make patient samples available to developers of in vitro diagnostics. Is Health Canada and or PHAC doing the same thing for Canadian developers? Are you aware, Ellie, or is that a question that should go to the more generic inbox?
So same as the answer for the Sarah question. Please send that question to our inbox and we'll be able to manage it internally. I can't speak to that during the webinar today, but I would be able to consult with some of the evaluators and our other colleagues to give you an answer. I do want to point out that for ventilators, we have received the permission of 2 manufacturers to get their contact information posted on our website for anyone who does want to manufacture ventilators or obtain some advice on design specifications, that type of thing. They are available on our the link that's entitled Notice to US FDA. I'm sorry, I forget the exact title of the link. I can point it out to you, Wendy, afterwards if you want to add a little footnote when you guys post the webinar.
Yep.
But for ventilator manufacturers, there are 2 companies that are offering their in-house expertise to help other manufacturers to retool their manufacturing facilities.
Okay, that's perfect. Tom, there's a question for you. How will open source designs be treated? Does the same 30% rule apply to it to get it patented, even if it was based on an open source design?
So open source software, of course, is a copyright issue, and that is the same as it always has been. Open source design, if you're relying on a standard that's been to which people have access, generally people are allowed to get access to, then there should be no problem just proceeding under the old rules if it's an open source. I'm sure I don't know that the reference, the 30% reference would be too.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Tom, for that. So there's been a number of questions related to, are we going to have future webinars? Yes, we are. What the topics will be is partly why we have this poll running right now. So if you feel strongly about any particular topics, please vote or send an email to Ryan or info@lifesciencesbc with some ideas. And if you have ideas of speakers too, we'd love to hear that as well. Ellie, this one's for you. Is the MDEL authorization path pursuable by an importer for a Class 2 device or higher, even without the legal manufacturer applying via the IO path?
A bit of a loaded question, and I want to make sure that I understand the question correctly. So if the person who asked that question, if I don't answer it the way that you intended it to be understood, please just again email that question to the inbox afterwards. So the MDEL licensing pathway is for importers and distributors of all classes of medical devices. It's for the activity of importing and distributing, among others. The IO authorization pathway is the authorization to sell that device in Canada. So if you were an importer and you want to import and distribute and sell a Class 2 medical device, the manufacturer first needs to get the IO authorization, and then you can go down the MDEL pathway for your activities of importation and distribution. So you can apply for the authorization on behalf of the manufacturer. There's a slot in the request form for a regulatory correspondent. So then you would be the one interacting with Health Canada, compiling all the information that's requested, managing the application. But it is the manufacturer themselves that need to sign the attestation and need to sort of authorize you to do that on their behalf.
Okay, thank you, Ellie. I think this brings us to the close. So thank you all for attending. We really would love your feedback on topics. We'll be sending out a post-event survey, so please give us your feedback on that. As I mentioned at the beginning, this was our first virtual webinar, and so we really would love that feedback. I want to thank Novature, and in particular Ali and Dana, for all the work that they did in helping us pull this together. And of course our speakers, Ellie, Ian, and Tom. You provided some very relevant information in a clear, concise manner that is really actionable. So we really appreciate that. You made it look very easy, but we know there's a lot of work behind the scenes in preparing these presentations. So thank you. For those of you that may not be aware, Life Sciences BC is a member-funded organization, and it's with the support of our members and sponsors that we're able to do all the events and types of activities that we do. So if you are not a member, we would really appreciate you consider joining, and the membership information was on the screen, or you can reach out to Ryan or info@Life Sciences BC. A couple of people have been asking about the future webinars. The best way to find out about those is to subscribe to our events newsletter or to watch our website, but we do plan to do more over the next couple of months. And based off of the feedback that you provided, oh, I can't see the poll results anymore, but it looks like lots of interest in information about non-dilutive funding, some of the financial relief programs, and some of the activities that are happening in BC. So more information to come on that. And with that, I think I will close it off. Again, thank you to Novature, and thank you to all of you for attending. Bye.